Welcome. Welcome. I think our session is now live. Um, my name is Kathleen Beagle, and I'm chairing the session on the digital divide, which is one of the first sessions for the conference going virtual this year. Welcome, everyone. We have three great papers that we're going to see today and have, I hope, a lively Q&A. I want to remind you, and for those of you who weren't in our plenary, we have two options for participants to engage in the session. There's a Q&A button on your screen where you can insert a question, and there's a chat option too, if that suits you better. You can also vote on questions that you want to, that resonate with you, that you want to kind of give extra oomph to, but all questions are welcome, so it's not a contest on the voting. And we will hear from the three papers in order through our recorded presentations. And then we'll have each paper have a brief discussion given by another paper in the panel, another author in the panel, which my colleague Esther will kindly moderate the Q&A and the chat. So I think I've gone over most of the housekeeping. I'll remind you now, but I'll also remind you at the end that when the session is over, we have a Meet the Author session where anyone's welcome to attend to have a more, continued discussion, informal chat with the presenters of the papers. So let me go to the first paper. This session is on the digital divide, and two of the three papers are global in coverage. And the third one, we're going to do a country deep dive looking at the case of slums in Nairobi and adolescent girls and boys' access to digital services and information and technologies. And I'll just say, as someone who works on gender for the World Bank in the World Bank gender group, this is a topic that greatly resonates with us both before COVID and certainly in the time of COVID. The issue of the digital divide is permeating discussions on access to education, as well as labor market implications of the shifting workforce and work from home options. So before we start in the first paper, I would like to give an opportunity to have Esther give a welcome to our participants and speakers. Esther, would you like to say a few words?
You're almost welcome, and we are delighted to have you on board, especially for this session. Feel free to send in your questions, listening, and also your comments are welcome. We'll be having the discussion as Kathleen has introduced already, and I'll be here to help and just moderate the Q&A session. So thank you and welcome.
And as a little more background, Esther and I are both pleased and honored to be part of the IUSSP scientific committee that helped organize this conference on population and poverty. And this is, I think, as you know, I can't remember what number are we at. We're in well over a dozen population and poverty events, which started with the Hewlett Foundation, and we're in our second year of IUSSP population and poverty. So with that, why don't we jump right in? Luca, would you like to get us started so we will hear about your wonderful work? Thank you.
So good morning, everyone. If I'm not mistaken, this is not only the first paper of the first session on digital divide, but it is also the first paper of the whole conference. So let me take the chance to thank the organizers of the second IUSSP Population, Poverty and Inequality Research Conference, and for the great work they put into transforming this event into a fully virtual one. So this paper is titled Safer If Connected, Mobile Technology and Intimate Partner Violence, and it is joint work with my friend and colleague Valentina Rotondi from the University of Oxford. And the paper builds and somehow fits into this recent stream of research that focuses on the implications of digital technology for socioeconomic development and demographic outcomes. So let me start with a graph that you perhaps already saw, which shows how fast some information and communication technologies, ICTs, have diffused relative to others. Let's focus on the red bars, which stand for mobile phone subscriptions, and let's focus on the black bar, which stand for mobile internet subscription. look at how fast they have diffused over time relative to, for instance, landline and fixed internet. And this is also something that we observe not only globally, but also regionally. So let's look now at these 6 different panels by macro region. And the same pattern of mobile phone and mobile internet diffusion is particularly striking in all of these regions. For instance, if you focus on Africa, you almost don't even notice landline. You only notice this huge growth of a mobile phone and internet subscriptions over time. The question is therefore, what are the implications of this diffusion for socioeconomic development and demographic outcomes? Well, this massive global social transformation has led scholars and policymakers to increasingly consider the potential for ICTs to empower marginalized communities and improve the lives of the poor across multiple domains, which could be related to any of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. In this work, we focus specifically on SDG number 5, which relates to empowering all women and girls and using enabling technology as a way towards attaining this goal. I also want to mention that this is an investigation that capitalizes on some previous published work that we conducted ourselves together with co-authors, which showed that mobile phones can indeed be leveraged to attain sustainable development. As a matter of fact, using data from about 150 countries, we showed in this previous work that mobile phones can be a vehicle for sustainable development by narrowing gender inequalities, enhancing contraceptive use in women's reproductive health, and reducing maternal and child mortality. What we left a little bit unanswered is the extent to which mobile phones matter for within couple dynamics, such as bargaining power within partners and instances of intimate partner violence, which we use here as a marker of women's status within the household. So this is exactly our contribution here. We ask the following question: can mobile phones contribute to improving the status of women by shaping their likelihood of experiencing instances of intimate partner violence? And we build this work on several premises, where the first one is that there hasn't really been large-scale empirical work on the connection between mobile phones and IPV as a marker of women's status. So what we do here is to leverage micro-level data from existing demographic and health surveys, which for the first time include a question on mobile phone ownership across 11 low-middle income countries. Also, we try to provide associational evidence, but also we try to complement this with causally oriented evidence through non-parametric matching techniques, and most importantly, through instrumental variable estimations built through geo-reference data. Also, I think what's important to mention is that we combine data for both women and men. So we provide this double perspective, which is something that research usually doesn't really do. Why should we expect a connection between technology and IPV? So indeed, our work relates to previous literature on the role or the power of the media, such as radio and television, on female status. This is a huge literature, mostly from development economists, that I don't have time to discuss here, but I want to mention that this closely relates to our work here. Also, there has been lots of work showing that mobile phones have an impact on several indicators of women's lives, such as financial independence and labor market prospects, food security, decision-making power in politics, and specifically, and that's why I draw this box here, there are these 3 channels that we see as crucial for this specific work. So mobile phones can facilitate effective communication and connectivity, facilitate access to information and financial services related to health, safety, and the economy, and help overcome physical boundaries where women are bound within their husband's social spheres and have limited freedom of movement. So while it might be reasonable to expect mobile phones to hold a similar or even enhanced potential with respect to radio or the television, theoretically speaking, the relationship between mobile phones and IPV might go either way. There has been some work consistent with the idea of mobile phones as empowering mechanisms. This work is from India and builds on the work of Jensen and Oster, and shows that mobile phones impacted the status of women positively by reducing men and women's tolerance for domestic violence and increasing women's autonomy in mobility and economic independence. However, there's also interesting qualitative work from selected communities in sub-Saharan Africa and East Asia, which shows that mobile phones may be disempowering devices. The rationale here is that solo ownership of mobile phones would be something that threatens the idea of male domination and challenges patriarchal norms, thereby ultimately increasing violence on the part of male partners to female partners. So as I mentioned, we combined demographic and health surveys from 11 low and middle income countries, mostly from 2015-2016, which is when this new variable was added, with ancillary sources from which we obtain either additional controls at the community level or instrumental variables. I will just touch briefly on each of these because all of these are explained in the text. But from the first source, we obtain nighttime lights, which we use as a proxy for social development at the community level as a control. And then from the other two sources, which are the Afrobarometer and the HRFC, we obtain mobile phone coverage in the local geographical unit of the respondent and lightning flash rates, which we have already used as instrumental variables for mobile phone ownership in other work. The main predictor is mobile phone solo ownership. Again, remember we have data both for men and for women. So this is solo ownership, which is a big innovation over previous data availability. And the outcomes are instead taken from the restricted domestic violence module, which is only available for some specific countries and surveys. And from here, we obtain 4 different variables: emotional violence, physical violence, sexual violence, all dichotomized. And then a violence index, which is either billed as the sum of the instances or as a dummy, which takes the value of 1 for any violence versus no violence. Let me also say here that we have measures both for violence experienced over the lifetime and violence experienced over the previous 12 months. And following some very helpful reviews that we just received, we are rerunning most analysis using the latter, and results are very consistent. And the type of controls we include are the standard ones. For instance, we include level of education, age, working status, marital status, household location of residence, and most importantly, wealth index, presence of radio and TV in the household, and access to the internet. So these two histograms provide some descriptive evidence on the share of men and women owning mobile phones. Women are in red, men are in blue. And what these two graphs show are basically two findings. The first one is that there's great variation across countries, with Burundi having some of the lowest shares of women owning phones, about 24%. Instead, Armenia having some of the highest shares of women owning phones, about 97%. Also, what we see is that shares among women are lower than among men in each individual country, which somehow provides preliminary evidence of digital gender divide in access to mobile phones. Instead, these 4 graphs provide descriptive evidence on the outcomes, and they basically show that women owning a mobile phone have a lower likelihood of experiencing each of these individual types of violence. So lower likelihood of emotional violence, lower likelihood of physical violence, sexual violence, and so on. Indeed, this may be driven by tons of observed and unobserved factors. It might also be driven by reverse causality. So what we try to do next is to clean these estimates gradually. So what we show here are results from linear probability models from full specifications, which include all controls listed above for each of the 4 outcomes here. And what we report is just the mobile phone estimated coefficient. What these results show is that there is a negative, strong, and robust association between mobile phone ownership on the part of women and each of these 3 types of violence individually. For instance, if we focus on physical violence, the second one here, the likelihood of experiencing physical violence for a woman owning a mobile phone is 3.7 percentage point lower than that of a woman without a mobile phone, which corresponds more or less to a 10% decrease. If we were interested in seeing results by country, we could simply run interaction between mobile phone and country dummies and see where the coefficients are negative or positive. As you can see, the sign of the mobile phone coefficient is negative is 9 out of the 11 countries considered, and it's statistically significant in 6 countries, mostly sub-Saharan African countries. Also, you see that in Malawi, the coefficient is negative but not significant, and interestingly, in Angola, the coefficient is instead positive and pretty strong. So this scenario is consistent with the idea of mobile phones as empowering mechanisms, but at the same time, when we look at further heterogeneity, there are some contexts that are also consistent with the idea of mobile phones as disempowering mechanisms. So So we then conducted several robustness checks, which I can only mention here due to time. We run instrumental variable models using both household level instrumental variables and cluster level instrumental variables. What we provide here are the marginal effects from bivariate probit models. And across all of these models, estimates are very much consistent with the ones reported before. Also, our estimates of a negative and statistically significant association are found also through non-parametric matching techniques and are also consistent when we aggregate up analysis at the community level, adding controls for local development proxied by nighttime lights. We then moved into the mechanism and said, okay, if mobile phones are supposed to empower women, so let's see if women who own a mobile phone actually hold higher decision-making power within the household. The DHS reports this set of questions, this set of activities, and asked who is the main decision maker on each of these activities. So we built a dummy equals to 1 if the woman alone or the woman with the husband is the decision maker on each of these specific activities. So each coefficient relates to each dependent variable. And as expected, there is a positive and significant association between mobile phone ownership on the part of women and decision-making power within the household. And second, we hypothesized that another mechanism could be related to a shift in men's attitudes. So we have information in the DHS on attitudes towards intimate partner violence, specifically attitude towards wife beating. So we build different dummies here for whether the man considers wife beating justifiable under any of these circumstances. So again, each of these is a dependent variable, and created a dummies accordingly. And again, as expected here, there is a strong negative association between mobile phone ownership on the part of men and deeming wife beating justifiable under each of these specific circumstances. So it seems there might be some mechanism whereby men's attitudes are shifting towards less acceptability of intimate partner violence. So to summarize, what we find in this work is that women's ownership of phones is associated with 7 to 11% decrease in likelihood of experiencing emotional, physical, and sexual violence, and that our results are pretty much consistent with two mechanisms. One, there is an empowerment mechanism whereby women owning mobile phones have higher decision-making power within the household. And the second one that relates to men's attitudes. So a change in men's attitudes towards less acceptability of domestic violence. Also, we want to stress that mobile phones are not only a proxy for socioeconomic development, and we show it here in our paper in many different ways. This work has lots of implications for what's going on in the post-COVID-19 era, and we would be happy to discuss discuss this with you in the Q&A session. So thank you very much for your questions and comments, and looking forward to having a discussion with you all. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Luca. We'll now move to our second paper, which is Mariana, also taking a global view, but this time on the internet. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Mariana Cunha, and today I'll be presenting a preliminary paper from my colleagues and I titled Leveraging Data on Facebook Populations to Understand Global Digital Inequality. So this paper is part of an ongoing project titled Digital Gender Gaps Using Big Data to Monitor Global Digital Gender Inequality. And it's motivated by the fact that the internet has radically transformed how individuals seek information, communicate, and access goods and services. This is even pointed out in the UN Sustainable Development Goal on gender equality, which pledges, among other things, to enhance the use of information communication technologies to promote the empowerment of women. Therefore, tracking the project progress on digital gender gaps is going to be key to ensure that women benefit from the opportunities afforded by the digital revolution. So what we do is we collect information on the aggregate number of monthly and daily Facebook active users by country, age, and gender from Facebook's Marketing Application Programming Interface, or API. Facebook has a lot of, the Facebook's data is very useful in a lot of ways, in part because of its large online population. They have reported 2.4 billion active users in the beginning of 2019, which is around half of all internet users. On top of that, we also have information on individuals' gender, location, age, etc. The original use for this data was actually for potential advertisers who wanted to market on Facebook. But from a social research perspective, this data can actually act as a sort of digital census. So we have aggregate, anonymous, and free of cost data that's still heavily underutilized in the social sciences. We have been collecting data for this project consistently since September 2018 for around 191 countries. Here it's just important to point out that with the API, you cannot go back in time. So we have data from when we started the project onwards, but we can't look at the data before that. And then from the data, we are able to compute what we call the Facebook Gender Gap Index, which is a strong predictor already, have been shown to be a strong predictor of internet access and mobile access gender gaps. So this index is constructed as follows. We get the female to male ratio of Facebook users with certain characteristic and divide that by the female to male ratio in the observed population with the same characteristic. And which means that a value of 1 indicates parity between men and women. Values smaller than 1 indicate that you have fewer women as Facebook users relative to men. And a value higher than 1 indicates that you have more women than men. We do this weighting by the real population from which we take the estimates from the UN to account for sex imbalances that can occur in real population structures, for example, in Qatar due to sex-selective migration. And we calculate this index by country for the overall adult population, so 18 and over, and also by 5-year age groups, so 15 until 65 and over. Here we see a map of the Facebook Gender Gap Index for the countries in our analysis for October 2020 for the adult population using monthly active users. And initially, we already can see some clear regional differences with the bigger gender gaps disfavoring women being found in Africa and South Asia. And actually, when you look at North America especially, and Europe, but also some countries in South America and Australia and New Zealand, you actually see that there are more women than men. So the darker colors indicate higher than 1, and the lighter colors indicate lower than 1 values. So what this is showing that in countries where internet access is almost universal, we see that women are actually accessing this platform more than men do. It's interesting as well, because here we're calculating the index with monthly users, but we can also calculate the index with daily active users, which these two measures are going to be highly correlated. But when the measure for the index using monthly active users is high, the index using daily active users is even higher, indicating that when women have access, they also utilize the data more intensively, because we can consider this daily active user as a measure of intensity of use, while monthly active users is a measure of access. We also see some interesting variations by age when we look at the indexes. So first of all, it's clear that differences between America and Europe and Africa and Asia again. So the mean value for America and Europe is the median value is always going to be 1 or higher. And for Africa, Asia, and Oceania is also included in Asia here, it's going to be lower than 1. We also see that for both regions, the higher numbers are going to be concentrated in the younger ages, so that the index, and so women are having more access than men at the younger ages, but also at the older ages. And we see a sort of pattern by age as well, where for the young adults, there is a decline, and in America and Europe, a sort of plateau around 1. And for Africa and Asia, you see actually a sort of decline up until the older ages when it starts to increase again. Another interesting way to look at this is to compare the real life population with the population from Facebook. So from a first look is already clear this lack of access by women in Africa and Asia and Oceania. So we see that the proportion of female Facebook users is much smaller than the proportion of male Facebook users for those regions. Which indicates that this is more than just lack of infrastructure for everyone. This is a clear barrier of access for women in these regions. which you don't really see so much in the Americas and Europe. Another interesting thing is that the Facebook's population is overrepresenting the younger population. This is especially clear for the Americas, where we actually speculate that there are some problems with duplicate accounts, but for the young age groups. But it's interesting that these duplicate accounts actually seem equally distributed between men and women, so it doesn't really affect the indexes that much. But this is an interesting figure to look at to see how the Facebook population, the limitations of the Facebook population, and how this data can actually be used for other types of demographical and sociological analysis. Important as well to look at changes over time. So like I mentioned, we've been collecting this since the end of 2018. And this, so on the left-hand side, we have the Facebook Gender Gap Index for the adults using monthly active users for 2019 in the dashed line and for 2020 in the solid line by these big regions. And what we see is that for Europe, Asia, and Africa, there is this increasing trend of the index. For Africa, the trend is not that clear, but there's still an increase over time. And for the Americas, the trend since around May and June of 2019 has actually been of decrease. However, for Africa and Asia, this increase actually means a continuation towards equality because the ratios are below 1. So that means that women are getting access faster than men. And for the Americans, because this ratio is already above 1, a decrease also means that their continuation towards parity. And because now that the market for women is closer to being oversaturated, let's say, men are actually becoming users faster than women are, and there's been this catch-up going on. But for Europe, the ratio is already higher than 1, but there's still an increase over time, meaning that women are still, the number of female users is still increasing faster than the number of male users, despite the fact that there's already more women than men in this data. And on the right-hand side, we see the same ratios for using daily active users. And then we see that the trends are somewhat similar. The increase is not so clear for Africa and Asia and Oceania, which kind of points to the idea of the differences between monthly users indicating access and daily users indicating intensity of use. So the intensity of use is not increasing as fast as the access to this platform for these regions. For the America, you see a decrease as well, as in the same way that the MAU did, the MAU measures did. And for Europe, it's interesting that we see this big increase around February and April of 2020, which coincides exactly with the dates of the first lockdowns due to COVID-19. So what we're hypothesizing here is that people were spending more time at home and therefore they were started to use Facebook more often. But it's interesting, first, that we don't really see this pattern for the other regions, but also that this represents the ratios, which means that the ratio is increasing, meaning that more women than men are starting to, the number of daily active female users is increasing faster than men. So during this COVID period, you had an increase more of female users than male users. And this can be seen more clearly when we look at the actual counts for users, for daily active users. So the blue line is for men, solid line 2019 or 2020, dashed line 2019, and the red is for women. And again, for Africa and Asia and Oceania, you mostly just see a continuation of this increase. So there's not really much happening during the COVID period so much. For Europe, however, you see there is a clear change in the patterns of what was going on before, especially for women. There's a big jump between February and April of 2020, which you don't see in 2019 as well. And again, for women, much bigger than for men. Even the Americas, you see a little bit of an acceleration of the number of users. And after April, there's close to like a plateau or a little decrease. But no, it's not really as clear as what happened in Europe. And the graph on the right is just another way to look at this. So this is the growth in the daily active users from 2019 compared to the same month in from 2020 compared to the same month in 2019. And you see that the growth for April and May was much higher than for the other months, indicating that really there is something going on there with the COVID and the digital access. So to conclude, as I said, this is part of an ongoing project. We are still collecting data and are currently in the process of cleaning the data set, removing outliers. And in the next steps, we hope to introduce panel data analysis now that we have data for more than 2 years, and continue to explore how offline gender inequality is correlated to online gender gaps. How this has changed over time, because we already looked at this for like 2018 data, and we've seen that offline data, offline measures of inequality related to women's well-being are really good at predicting inequality in this online gender gap, but we want to see what happens over time. And again, we also want to continue to explore these changes around the COVID-19 period and to see how the pandemic has affected patterns of internet use and digital gender inequality. A big advantage of this data set when compared to more traditional surveys is exactly this time component, because we collect data for every day. So we are able to see changes week to week on a week-to-week basis, and are able to, for example, look at the exact dates where lockdown started and ended and how this has possibly affected the patterns of use for specific countries. But that's all the time I have for today. Thank you very much, and I look forward to any questions.
Thank you, Mariana. And now we'll go to our third paper, which is taking us down to the country level, in particular in the slums in Nairobi. So Roan from the Population Council in Nairobi. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Ron Ochako. I'm from Keshobora Center for Social and Health Research. We are a national level NGO that is based in Nairobi, Kenya. Today, I'll be speaking on inequitable access to social media among young people living in the urban slums of Nairobi. And we are asking, what are the implications for programming? Just to talk briefly, we all understand that so many programs are now advocating for the use of social media to reach young people, because so many young people are assumed to now have access to social media. And so we carry out these analyses to try and understand issues around access to social media among young people. And as a background, Kenya is experiencing rapid urbanization just like the rest of the world. And most of this growth is experienced in Nairobi, which is the capital city of Kenya. And in Nairobi, evidence now confirms that the gap between the rich and the poor continues to grow. And part of the resulting things from this is that there has been a growth in urban slums, where so many people are now being pushed into the urban slums. And adolescents and young people living in the urban slums face so many challenges that are coupled with the difficulties they face as they transition into adulthood. And part of the challenges that the adolescents and young people face include issues around inadequate access to health services, low school enrollment, lack of social services, and even other amenities, among other challenges. And all these challenges are likely to have negative impacts on their health and well-being. However, programs targeting adolescents and young people increasingly use social media platforms to reach them with their interventions. However, very few of these interventions have considered issues around access, particularly among young people who are living in the urban slums. And it's for this reason that we carry out this study seeking to address three main objectives, with our first objective being to just provide a description of the adolescents who are living in the urban slums of Nairobi. And secondly, we seek to understand the differentials and inequity in access to social media. And our third objective is to try and make recommendations for programming for adolescents, particularly those who are living in urban slums. And looking at our methodology, the data that we use for this analysis is from the widest project that is known as NICITU, which is a quasi-experimental study that was implemented in 3 informal settlements in Nairobi, Kenya in 2018 up to 2020, and that is Kariobangi, Mathare, and Dandora. So the main overall objective of the NICITU project was to try and promote equitable gender norms among young people. However, for our study, we analyzed data from 4710 adolescent girls and boys between the ages of 10 and 19 who took part in the quantitative baseline survey. And our study followed all the required guidelines for conducting research with human subjects, and we were able to obtain both institutional and local IRB approvals for the study, and we also obtained written consent and assent from all our study participants before we implemented our survey. And from our analysis, here we describe the characteristics of our study participants, and looking at our outcome variable of interest, which is the use of social media, we see that it's classified in 3 main categories, which is adolescents who are using social media more than once in a day. And then we have our second category as adolescents who are using social media once a week or just once a month. And then we have those who are not using social media at all. And from this, it's evident that for our participants in this study, 74% of them overall reported not having any access to social media. However, we observe differences when we consider the use and access to social media between boys and girls, where 19% of the boys report using social media more than once a day, while just 12% of the girls report having the same experience. And then when we look at the ages of our participants, about half of our participants were between ages of 10 to 14. However, when we look at the gender differences, we see that slightly more of our participants in the ages 10 to 14 were boys, that is 56%. However, for the girls, we had an almost equal distribution between girls in the ages of 10 to 14 and 15 to 19. And since these are young people who are still under the care of their caregivers, the question on primary caregiver seemed to be almost universal among both adolescent boys and girls, where both reported their mother as their primary caregiver. However, when you look at adolescents who reported not having a primary caregiver, we see that 8% of the girls report not having a primary caregiver, while only 2% of the boys report not having a primary caregiver. And in some other further analysis that is not presented here, majority of our participants report not having a primary caregiver for the girls, while those in the ages between 15 to 19. And in terms of those who report being currently in school, we see slightly more boys, 81% reporting being currently in school, compared to just 74% of the girls reporting being in school. And then, so to understand the factors that influence the use of social media, we carried out a multinomial logistic regression, where we considered our outcome variable, which is the use of social media, that is in 3 categories, where we have those who use social media more than once a day, those who use social media once a week or just once a month. And then we have our third category of those who do not use social media at all. So for our comparisons, like we all understand when we are carrying out a multinomial regression, we have a reference category, then we compare one group to the reference category, and then the third group to the reference category. And so here it's evident if we look at those who report not being currently in school, majority of them, we see that majority of them were more likely to be to spend more time on social media compared to their counterparts who are school going. And then further, if we look at the characteristics of the primary caregiver, it's evident that adolescents who report their father as their primary caregiver, all those who report not having a primary caregiver, were less likely to spend more time on social media compared to their counterparts who report their mother as their primary caregiver. And then further, we also look at access to various forms of media like the radio, television, and use of phone to call or text, or the use of the internet to browse, and how these have an influence on whether an adolescent will spend more time on social media than just spending some little time on social media. And it's evident that that adolescents who spend little time, all those who do not spend any time listening to radio, were less likely to spend more time on social media compared to adolescents who are spending more time listening to the radio. And we see similar results for watching TV, where those who report just spending a week or a month to watch a TV as compared to those who watch TV almost every day, this category were less likely to spend more time on social media. And we see similar findings even for the access to their phones for to call or text, or even access to the internet for browsing, where those who report not having any access to the internet for browsing were less likely to report that they would spend more time on social media compared to their counterparts who are using the phone 5 times or even more in a day to browse. And so now looking at the other category of our group, the ones who are not spending any time at all on social media compared to those who are spending at least some little time on social media, we find that participants between ages of 15 to 19 were less likely to report that they were not spending any time at all on social media compared to their younger counterparts. Further again, we see that participants who report having at least secondary education, they were more likely to report that they were spending at least some little time on social media than not spend time at all, if we make a comparison between them and their counterparts who only had primary level education. And we have seen there's a similar trend for listenership to radio, where we see some significance, and even on the use of the phones, where those who are not using the phone at all here are more likely to report not spending any time at all on social media compared to those who are using a phone maybe 5 times or even more in a day. Further, we see gender differences in terms of the use of social media, where female participants were more likely to spend no time at all on social media compared to their male counterparts. And so now, based on these results, we arrive at our conclusion and our recommendations, where overall, we see that the use of social media was very low for this study group, and it was even much lower for the younger adolescents between ages of 10 to 14 from our Nairobi's informal settlements. Further, we also observe gender differences in terms of use and access to various forms of media, which include browsing the internet, use of social media, and even use of phones to either call or text. And it's evident that boys reported having more access to all the various forms of media, including social media, compared to girls. It's therefore evident that inequitable access to digital devices, particularly for our participants in our informal settlements in Nairobi, have implications for existing and future interventions that are targeting adolescents and young people. Also, we make a recommendation to program implementers who should tailor programs to be based on user characteristics and conduct research to understand equity prior to delivering an intervention targeting young people, particularly on a platform like social media. So that brings us to the end of our presentation, and I will be looking forward to your questions and further discussions. Thank you.
Thank you, Ron. That brings us to the completion of our 3 presentations. I would like to now invite a short discussion by each of the authors on a counterpart paper in the session. So, Ron, we're going to jump back to you, and if I could ask you to discuss some of your comments or observations on Luca's work. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you, everyone. Just give very quick comment. Lucas,
can you speak? Yeah, that's better. Thank you.
Hear me? Okay. So thank you, everyone. And I'm going to give my quick comments on Lucas' presentation. And I had an opportunity to read the paper in detail. It was a very well-researched paper. They have done a thorough review of literature to support the work that they are doing. And generally, I'll say that they address a very important topic, which is on the intimate partner violence, which they clearly state as a violation of the rights of women, and that is indeed true, supported with a lot of references and literature that they have outlined in their paper. Then they go ahead and talk about the use of mobile phone. And I'd say that like in our spaces, particularly in Kenya, there's a mixed feedback in terms of like the use of mobile phone and linkages with it to intimate partner violence. And I'd say that they clearly brought out that particular aspect where they talk about the use of mobile phones can either lead to both negative and positive outcomes on the lives and well-being of women. So that was very, very clearly outlined. Then they went ahead to just share information on how mobile phone use has enabled delivering of programs that are targeting women and other segments of the population. So that was very, very clear. And I liked how they went into detail to just share evidence on what has been done in the field. Then they also clearly stated what their objectives were, which was on trying to understand how the use of mobile phone could promote women's, could be a maker of women's status. And so for me, I'd just move straight on to some key observations that I felt going through the paper, with the first one being a proposal that they made to use the DHS data, which is nationally representative data from like different countries, a data that provides indicators that are almost comparable across different countries. But then again, they brought in an insight where they said they were going to pull in data from other sources that could now help further strengthen their analysis, although that did not come out clearly in his presentation, but that was very, very clear when I read the paper in detail. And so I'm hoping that I'll be very much interested into seeing how that analysis goes, because they were proposing a use of very different data sets, which to me, I thought was very, very interesting. And then the other key observation that I noticed from the paper that they are working on is they talk about the potential of the relationship of intimate partner going either having negative impact on the lives of women and positive impacts. And I'd say that from my point of view, and maybe what I have seen in literature, there has been a lot of information on the use of mobile phone, most of the time leading to intimate partner violence. So for me, it was very interesting just to see the positive aspects of technology in empowering women and giving women more freedom to make decisions around their well-being and their welfare. So I'd say they bring out an aspect that I'd say I haven't seen in other papers that I have read or other research that I have come across in my work. And that to me was very interesting. But then again, like one observation that I made, I could talk about is while I was reading the paper, I tended to see them have different sections about like a very detailed section on an introduction where they went ahead to even discuss the results of their paper before they shared what the methodology was and what the analysis aspect of analysis was. So that kind of confused me. So I guess maybe it could be just a new way of them presenting their information, because the detailed paper had an abstract, then it had an introduction section that was very detailed, and it went ahead and shared information. Then they went ahead to still provide background information that was very well researched and very detailed. So I guess, yeah, I got mixed up in the presentation, but overall I'd say that this is a very well researched paper. They have done a very thorough literature review to support the work that they are doing, and the analysis was very much well organized. So for me, I'd say there were lots of positive things that I have learned from this paper. And with that, I say I'm wishing the team the best of luck as they finalize their paper and hopefully submit it for publication in maybe one of the journals. Thank you.
Thank you, Roan. Thank you for both the positivity of your comments and the practical nature of some of them too on the packaging. Luca, can you please give us some of your reflections on Mariana's work on Facebook?
Yeah.
Thank you.
So first of all, thank you very much, Ron. I will be happy to discuss more about some of the points you raised afterwards. I prepared a very, very short presentation, which I will share with you. Can you, well, give me a second, slideshow, play from start. Can you see?
Yes.
Okay, so, well, first of all, I was glad to be the discussant on this paper, mostly because I already knew it. I'm working with one of the authors with some of these data to track the digital gender divide in Latin America. So I was somehow already aware of the benefits and the flaws of some of this data. And I definitely believe the benefits outweighed the flaws. I tried to follow the structure that was given to us. So I will give a short summary of the paper of what I think the main findings were. And indeed, the main finding is that the paper shows a huge heterogeneity in the Facebook Gender Gap Index across regions of the world, with mostly women lagging behind in Sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, but also evidence that this lagging behind is narrowing over time towards showing a movement towards more gender equality. And conversely, in Europe, we instead see that the gender gap favors women, except for Southern Europe, in which both use and intensity of Facebook are instead not favoring women yet. Also, I found very interesting their description of variation by age, which as a demographer, I find essential and also a huge benefit of this data. And what they find is that male users tend to outnumber female users between the mid-20s to the early 60s. And then I also found, although it's still pretty much underdeveloped, interesting that they made use of their daily data, or in general, real-time data, to track a connection with the COVID-19 pandemic. And what they find so far is an increased use among women in Europe, but not much else going on elsewhere. I think this is just a function of the preliminary analysis they did, and I'm sure they will find much more as they move forward. Moving to the pros, which were very nicely highlighted in the presentation, I think these data from Facebook are very useful because they provide real-time insights, and they are really key when some unexpected or sudden events happen, such as the COVID-19 pandemic or any other kind of shock that we might think of, especially in low and middle income countries, a hurricane or any weather-related shock. So by having access to this real-time data, they really have a wealth of information that they can leverage to track consequences for socioeconomic development. Then I think, again, the pros is that they can use this data to identify variation by sex, but even more importantly, variation by age, which very few other sources give access to. And in general, I see this as a key descriptive tool that serves as a stepping stone for other analysis. So even when I think about the analysis that I presented myself, it's in general always essential to know who has access to this information and who or connectivity or technology, and who uses this technology. Because if we don't know who actually has access to this technology, there's not even much point in exploring the consequences of this technology for socioeconomic development. So I see this whole work as a very important stepping stone and descriptive background for any other kind of analysis that assesses the impacts on socioeconomic development. When it comes to the cons, these were also kind of highlighted in the paper. Sometimes, especially young people might have duplicate accounts, which boosts these ratios a little bit, even though they highlight that this is very much reflected both in women and men. So this balances out, but still this may be an issue to take care of. Also, obviously, access to Facebook does not fully proxy for access to internet. There are tons of people who are on internet but are not on Facebook. So even if they show that there are high correlations, we cannot take these for granted. And this is very much related to the problem of representativeness. Though I would also say here that now there are many techniques to take care of these issues, such as weighting techniques or reweighting techniques, which can help to control this issue. And also what I found nice about their work is that their measures account both for access to Facebook and for use or intensity of use, but there's not much information on knowledge, and there's plenty of research that shows that digital skills are essential. So even if some people have access to Facebook or technologies in general, they might not have the digital skills to leverage in this technology. And this is an issue not just for their paper, but for any paper, including my own, in which there are no specific questions on digital skills, so on the ability of using this technology. In terms of next steps, I would have liked to see in the paper some trends over time by country, not just by macro region, because I think that even within macro region, there might be very interesting different trends across countries. And also I was wondering if you could say a little bit more for those who are a little less acquainted with these techniques about whether the API allows to get at within country heterogeneity. So could we get at distinctions between rural and urban areas? And then I gave some suggestions for the last part of the analysis, which was the most underdeveloped. And in these regressions, which I think are very useful, I would not only include measures of gender gaps, but also predictors that relate to, for instance, women's situation in the labor market, which ties very nicely to the COVID-19 crisis, such as, for instance, the female to male share of unemployed and the female to male share part-time. This is all for now for me. And I'm looking forward to the discussion afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you, Luca, for those comments and the PowerPoint to go with them. Now we'll go to our third round of comments, which will be Mariana giving comment on Ron's work in Kenya. Thank you.
Hello, everyone, and thank you, Luca, very much for the very detailed comments. I look forward to talking to you about these. And about focusing on Ron's paper now, as we've seen in the presentation, the paper looked to understand access to social media and other types of telecommunication technologies among teens in the urban slums of Nairobi in Kenya. And the main results showed that these teens had limited use to these technologies, so the social programs that hope to reach the population through social media would not be effective without first working on expanding the access to all of the population. And they also point to gender inequality in the access, especially for the older groups of 15 to 19, where girls are shown to have less access than boys. I think this is a very important paper that highlights how understanding inequalities in the access of these telecommunication technologies, especially it's going to be very important, especially from a social policy perspective, because as you mentioned, one could assume that because Nairobi is a big urban city, that the internet access would be widespread and have a good way to reach things in terms of social policies, but what you've shown here is that there's still much inequality in access between socioeconomic groups that would need to be addressed first. And I think that these types of country-specific analysis are very important. Yeah, we definitely need more research that looks at marginalized populations just as much as the ones that such as me and Luca were doing, where it's more like global averages or the big picture. These types of country analysis are going to be very important to take into account when looking for future steps on what to do next about social policies and how to deal with these inequalities, because we need to know the details of every specific country, really. I also really like that you collected analyzed information on different types of violence. Because it showed that those lacking access to social media are also marginalized in other ways. That also connects with Luca's presentation, but I think that's also something that we need more research about. But in terms of how this could be extended, I know this was based on a survey done in 2018, but if you're able to collect more data on this, or if there was a second wave of some sort, I think could be very interesting if there was information on access to devices. And also, like Luca mentioned about in my case that we don't have these, but information, if you're doing these types of services, you could collect information of knowledge of use of these devices. And so, like, do these teens own their cell phone? Is it shared through the family, or how do they have access to computers, etc.? Because that could be a good way to understand this inequality that you're seeing, especially by gender, and to also help introduce policies that deal with this lack of access as well. But within the limitations of your current data, something that I think would be interesting to expand in your paper would be a more contextualization of your population, especially if you aim to publish this paper in an international journal, because you mentioned in your results differences, for example, by ethnic groups. But for me, who's an outsider and don't really know much about Kenya, I don't really know what the ethnic groups mean. So it'd be good to kind of inform your reader a little bit more about this. So for example, you show differences between Protestants and Catholics, but also as well, what does that mean in the context of Kenya specifically, or how does mostly I would like to see more contextualization of your sample and of your variables. But other than that, I thought the paper was quite interesting. As I said, there's a lot that needs to be done in relation to small scale and country specific research on inequality. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Mariana. That's very useful. Okay, so now I'll ask my colleague, well, let me first offer the opportunity to the authors. If you have any specific responses you would like to give, and of course, I welcome you to coordinate with your discussant after the session at the Meet the Authors moment, or even after the seminar. So let me go in order of the papers. And Luca, is there anything you'd like to say in response to some of the issues that were brought up by Ron?
Well, I was first of all very glad to see that she was intrigued and somehow surprised by the positive result that we find in our paper. And I was also interested by the fact that most of the literature that she knows from Africa finds the opposite. Because when I was doing the review myself, I couldn't really find that much research suggesting that mobile phones are negative are negatively related with intimate partner violence. Indeed, the study that she talks about from Kenya, I think is the one that we mentioned in our paper. And that's a very interesting qualitative study that well complements our work and that very much helped us to frame our two hypotheses towards mobile phones as being empowering or mobile phones as being disempowering, as we call it in the paper. But overall, I'm very grateful for the positive comments, and I'm glad she finds some promise in this paper and she sees some future in the paper itself. Thank you very much again, Ron.
Great. Mariana. Anything to
Yeah.
add?
Thank you, Luca. I think just a couple of things. As you mentioned about the trends by country, I think that's something we're working on right now, and like what's the best way to present this, because we have 191 countries. So we're and we know that we have data for 2 years, daily data for 2 years. So basically trying to decide like how we're going to present so much data. And we also already discussed that these like showing by region is good, but there's also so much variation within the regions that we can't just say that just present the region. So that's something we're working on. And there's definitely a lot of interesting variations within the country, like by country. And within country heterogeneity, we're also trying to, for right now, we don't have that much data, but we're trying to work with Facebook right now to get this data, this information. So for certain countries, you can look into these within country. And yeah, that's something that's on our radar to keep working on. And for the analysis that you said, the last part, which is basically, we're looking at how other types of inequality relate to this online inequality. We also, because this analysis was basically done with the 2018 data, we haven't really continued with this data. So we're now in the process of updating our variables, basically getting more updated data for 2020. And then we want to run this as a panel analysis as well. And then we're going to add a lot more variables as well. But yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Rowan, over to you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Mariana, for the feedback you have provided. And like you say, there is still a lot that should be done around issues around marginalization, particularly now during the COVID-19 period, where most learning institutions were promoting the use of maybe social media platforms or the use of digital devices to promote learning, now that schools have been closed for a very long time here in the country, in Kenya. So I guess, yeah, sure, we need to do a lot more work. And hopefully, we will collect more information that would help answer a lot of the other questions that you raise. Then you also raise a very important point on the need to maybe collect information that would share more insights around access to maybe the devices. We realized that that was a limitation when we conducted our baseline survey. So from the second wave of data that we collected, we added in an additional question just to understand if the phones that these people say they use, or even either if it's a laptop, whatever device they are using, if they own it or they are sharing it at the family level. So we will have at least more information that would now bring in more insights in terms of ownership and access to the digital devices that would promote the use of social media platforms or the different forms of media by these young people. So thank you so much for the additional insights. And we are hoping that we will continue to finalize this work and add in more information from the points that you have raised to make it, to contextualize particularly the issues that you raise around ethnicity and religion, and to just figure out how those would now tie in with the evidence that we are collecting, and in case we need to maybe even collect further information qualitatively to supplement some of the trends that we are seeing in our quantitative data. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Ron. May I hand it over to Esther to ask if you'd like to draw attention to any of the Q&A questions that have popped up.
Sorry. Yes, we did have two questions that came up in the Q&A, and one was for Luca. He did answer that question, but then it would be good to share with the rest of the participants, whoever was not able to view. There was a question that came in from someone, and it was that is it that mobile phones empower women to resolve conflict in a non-violent manner, or do they enable them to escape from violent conflicts? And then how do you differentiate smartphones, that's with internet connection, from traditional mobile phones? Do you consider that the two might play different roles concerning gender and conflict? That was a question that came in for Luca from Samuel. And then we also had a question that came in for Dr. Ochako, which is, do you control for access to internet while studying access to social media? those were the two questions that we had, and I would like to give a minute to each of them to respond and maybe add a few things that they were not able to add in the Q&A space. Welcome, Luca, you go first.
Thank you, Esther. Thank you. Yeah, I think Samuel raised a very interesting question, and which I can repeat. He asked, is it that mobile phones empower women to resolve conflict in a non-violent manner, or do they enable them to escape from violent conflicts? So my answer is that based on the data we have and the methodological techniques that we used to approach this study, our evidence is much more consistent with his second hypothesis that mobile phones enable women to escape from violent conflicts. And by this, I don't really mean escape from violent conflicts, but I also mean that they make them more likely to report violent instances by, for instance, having access to some remote healthcare facilities, or having access to forum groups where other women participate, and so on. So in this sense, our evidence is more consistent with his second hypothesis. He also raises a very good point about the distinction between simple mobile phones and smartphones. Unfortunately, the DHS data include a general question on mobile phones now, which they just recently added. So we don't have any way of distinguishing between mobile phones and smartphones, but we agree that the two might have different consequences. One way in which we kind of take care of this issue is to control for whether the household has some access to the internet. And the other way that we tackle these issues by resorting to some external information, which somehow shows that the huge diffusion of mobile phones now, even in some of the poorest countries, concerns actually smartphones. So we are, based on external evidence, somehow confident that the majority of mobile phones that these women hold are actually smartphones. This is something we discuss towards the end of the paper, but in terms of having concrete data, we don't have 100% certainty. So it's a limitation that we can acknowledge, but so far we cannot do much on. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Luca. Now please welcome Dr. Ochako to respond. Ron, please welcome.
Yes, so thank you for the question.
I don't know that she can, okay.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Hello?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, so thank you for the question on if we controlled for access to internet. And like as we begin our analysis, we try and identify factors that would have an influence on the use of social media. So independently, we are certain that access to internet has an influence on the use of social media. And then in our multivariate model, we control for so many factors, including access to internet. So yes, indeed, we did control for that as we were running our analysis. But I can share more if you have further questions.
Thank you so much. So those were the two questions.
Great.
Sorry, you were muted. You were muted. You were muted, Dr. Ochako. You were muted towards the last remarks you made.
Yeah, so I was just saying that in case we need to discuss more, we can do this during the next session where we will have more time to engage and discuss.
All right. Okay, thank you so much. Kathleen, do we have some few minutes? And I just like maybe 2 or 3 minutes, and I'll just raise a few things. I also read through the 3 papers. The first, which was Safer If Connected, the paper from Luca. And it's very interesting, the results about how access to mobile technology plays a key role, especially in terms of how women are able to report these incidences, and probably that's what raises the relationship that there's likely to be a reduction. However, my one concern that I have is that did you also consider the possibility that access to these technologies can actually increase monitoring of women in general by their partners? or women or men, either way, because intimate partner is really intimate partner, could be women or men. Did you consider also the angle that it can increase monitoring of their activities online, of who they talk to, of their social connections, of their resources, wherever they have their resources? Some people have everything like on their phone, their bank is on their phone, their social groups are on their phones, everything basically. So have you considered that? And then in what way could it be a disempowering tool, and what can be done? What policies can be done to safeguard the partners in such cases? That's from the paper from Lucas. And then the second paper from Mariana. Thank you so much. This it's interesting to see. It's one of those studies that's one of a kind. The first I'm seeing, I would say, the first I'm seeing about Facebook, and then the disaggregation that you use. It highlights a lot of things that are very informative in terms of the gender divide. And even for this paper too, I just thought through while reading that, what are some of those emerging topics that you see in the analysis, like if they do have activity online per day, but which activities or main search, just overall topics would you notice by gender, across gender? Generally, what do men search for? What do women search for? What are their interests? In this day of technology, we have influencers. Who are those influencers? And in what areas are they? Which ones are male? Which ones are female? So that even in the way of trying to leverage social media and leverage the use of technologies, we see a guided format, or we can already foresee where things are going as we analyze the key emerging topics across a different gender. And then the paper from Dr. Ochako, inequitable access to social media across young people living in urban slums in Nairobi, the implications for programming. This was also very interesting. And the comment I liked most is that while development interventions can come in and try to leverage on availability of social media, are they really able to target youth, and which youth are they targeting? Will the interventions be equitably distributed across gender? But even for this, I did have one of the questions I had already was asked by Mariana, thank you. But the other was about time. We know that overall, girls tend to follow into the pattern of women in general, even in the allocation of time, in the allocation of their resources, in the responsibilities they have. So, is there a way you can give a background to time use even for girls? How does this play out in terms of how they access social media? They have as much time to access social media like the boys have, or is the traditional perceptions and the stereotyping within our communities playing out even at this young age, that already they get into the roles of reproductive roles of care, trying to check on this, manage the household, and then because of that, they're not able to have much time to engage in social media. Thank you so much.
Esther, I think you've set up a round of papers for the next IUSSP conference right there. So I hope everyone was taking notes and we can find the money to get more data, especially qualitative data. I think that was a point that came up that I really appreciate. But I think we're like 2 minutes over, if my math is correct, which is not a bad thing. But I am going to suggest that we pivot to the Meet the Authors opportunity window for those of us who are able to, and others can take a bit of a break, get a stretch before the next session kicks off, I believe in about 30 minutes, if my math is correct again, hopefully. So with that, I want to thank all the three presenters, both for your role of doing great research, taking the time to prepare the video and your presentations, and also taking on discussing your counterpart papers in the session. Esther, thanks for managing the Q&A and putting out some really heavy ideas at the end there to take us into our next line of work. So I think you can find online how to get into the Meet the Author session. We hope that many of you can join us there for a bit of a chat. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you so much. Bye for now.
Bye.
See you in a short while.
See you soon.